So what I want to talk to you today, as Dan has mentioned to you, is biofuels development, particularly what the state of the art is with respect to how these are developing in the United States, and just one slide on what we're doing at NREL. And so it's kind of a different talk for me to give. Normally we're pretty technical and we get into what I would call the gory details of how we take biomass apart and transform it into fuels and chemicals. So that's a lot of chemistry, but this was more fun to do because I got to take a look at what actually is happening in the United States and outside the United States, and how companies are actually developing these processes to make fuels and chemicals a reality. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about that. But before we get into that, I want to show you what biomass is and what the chemical complexity of these species are as we try and transform them into fuel and chemical components. And then I broke the developments down into three areas. Thermochemical processes, so those are high temperature processes that take biomass to fuels and chemicals. Biochemical, which utilize microbes and algae to do the chemical transformations, and those are generally fairly low temperature processes. And then finally, what's developing are hybrid processes where we're marrying different technologies together to get at fuels and chemicals. And then just a brief summary of what I've talked to you about tonight. So what is biomass? And I want to make a distinction here, and I want to be very clear about it. What we're working on is with biomass, it's called cellulosic biomass. It's not food biomass like corn. So this is all the components of biomass that don't go to feed and fiber, if you will, but are materials I'll show you in a moment where they come from. But biomass itself has three constituents. So there's lignin, and that's 15 to 25% of biomass, and it's shown chemically in the red species, which are primarily ring compounds. Hemicellulose is 23 to 32% of what makes up biomass, and those are the sugars, and you can see their chemical structure in the blue species in the middle. Then finally we have cellulose, and that's the most abundant form of biomass carbon. And you can see that it's polymers of glucose. Glucose is a sugar. It's a good biochemical feedstock, but as well we can utilize it for thermochemical reactions. The point is the three components of biomass have very different chemical structures, and it's our task to try and figure out how to transform those into the fuels and chemicals that we need. And so, looking at biomass on the left in terms of its chemical components, and this is what we want to turn it into on the right. So what you're looking at are representative species of jet fuel. There's other materials in there as well, but primarily you have straight chain hydrocarbons and also ring compounds. Gasoline components is the second hydrocarbon fuel that DOE has mandated that we look at developing from biomass. And you can see again, these are branched hydrocarbons on the left, and also the ring structures repeated in the middle compound. On the right, you'll notice again a branched hydrocarbon that actually has an oxygen in it. And that's important for the following reason, because if you look at the biomass components on the left, there's up to 40% oxygen in those molecular species. You look at the fuel components on the right, very little oxygen. So there is one of the fundamental problems we have with taking biomass into fuels. What do we do with all that oxygen? And so primarily, you use a catalyst to deoxygenate biomass, similar to what you might do in the petroleum industry. What I want to point out is that catalysts really are costly. The petrochemical industry, I know, would certainly say that. And so that's one primary cost component at getting from biomass to biofuels. As well, process conditions and yields also impact cost. Cost is a key driver within the Department of Energy. When we're doing these type of reactions, overall process costs are closely monitored to make sure that we're hitting cost targets. The other species that I'm not going to talk too much about, but also showed up in red, is syngas. If you take those structures, those complex structures on the left, and you thermochemically decompose them all the way down the chemical energy well to hydrogen and CO, you have what is called syngas. Those are the building blocks of fuels and chemicals. But it's also taking every bit of biomass down to its very simplest component, and that's costly in terms of energy. So just point that out. What we're trying to do, instead of going to syngas in the next 5 years as a fuel precursor, is trying to understand how to take those biomass components and turn them into the species you see on the right with not having to go all the way down to syngas. Okay, so these are the two routes that I'm going to talk about today. So you have transformation through chemical intermediates. That's the biochemical route that I just spoke about, and it's called biochemical conversion. In the red box is the thermochemical conversion processes, and there's two that I want to talk about today. Gasification takes us all the way down to syngas, which I just talked about. Pyrolysis is another thermochemical method that tries to take that biomass and take it to building blocks, not syngas, but preserve those structures to get them to transform over into fuel-type species. And so this is probably the most complex slide I'm going to show you today. But the biochemical conversion, generally these processes go through enzymatic hydrolysis. Takes an enzyme, which is a chemical that speeds up reactions, similar to what a catalyst does. And in this case, we're taking cellulosic biomass, converting it to sugars through enzyme action, fermenting those sugars to get to products that we want to use. In this case, it would be ethanol. Thermochemical conversion does, as I just described, takes those biomass polymers apart and at a higher temperature, either to syngas or to species that are called pyrolysis type materials, and then they have to be catalytically upgraded to fuels. What I want to point out to you on the left is some of the feedstocks that are used in order to get to fuels are fairly diverse. When we talk about biomass at NREL, it's woody and herbaceous type species. Other things that can be used are agricultural waste, municipal solid waste, and algae, so I'll touch on those briefly. Point is, all of these pathways are being utilized currently to get to fuels and some chemical species. Again, the overall driver is we have to be efficient and we have to do this economically. And so if you want to look at overall biofuels, and this is just a good friend of mine's opinion, so of where we're at right now. In terms of near-term production, you all have heard about ethanol, I know, either from grain or cellulosic materials, and that's currently ongoing in commercial processes. Biodiesel and green diesel to gasoline are also fairly near-term processes that are in the marketplace. A little bit longer term is pyrolysis liquids, which are the liquids you form from thermochemical biomass processing to fuels, are currently being developed. And syngas is also currently being developed to a variety of liquids that are fuel precursors. And then finally, a little longer term are the algal-based fuels, and then hydrocarbons from the hydrogenation of hydrocarbons, carbohydrates, and lignin. I kind of have a little bit of a diversion from this. I would say the last four are probably equally being developed as we speak, but it gives you a feel for where we're at with respect to overall biofuels development in this country. I want to touch just briefly on syngas and why it's still of interest. It's being de-emphasized as a platform at the Department of Energy because several demonstrations have just successfully showed that you can get to ethanol from syngas. But when I talk about it being a building block, these are the various materials that you can form from syngas, from biomass, and it's fairly extensive. A lot of these are old technologies. The Germans did this during World War II. There's been a lot of improvements in catalytic processing that make some of these processes attractive. Okay, so switch gears a little bit and give you an idea of where we're at with some of these processes to actually making fuels. So gas to liquids, GTL, is pretty much a mature technology. Cost is a key driver, but if you want to look at the lower right picture, that is Sasol's, one of their reactors for Fischer-Tropsch synthesis of petroleum products from syngas. That is a huge reactor. This is a very cost-intensive process. This is practiced in South Africa. They don't have petroleum reserves, so this is their way to get at gasoline-type supplies. Hasn't been proven with biomass syngas yet. However, there's a company called Rentech, and a lot of this information I've pulled off the web in the last couple days. They're actually looking in their Commerce City facility, which happens to be located outside of Denver, at taking biomass syngas to FT fuels, particularly jet fuel, and I believe they are testing the fuels they make with Boeing and in their jet engines. And so you have a generic process down here, but what they're working at with currently is biomass-derived syngas that gets cleaned up through a variety of cleaning processes because there are contaminants in syngas that must be removed before you go to downstream synthesis. And as I said, they're producing jet fuel, and I've understood in the last few weeks they've successfully produced jet fuel from biomass syngas, and that's going to be tested in Boeing engines as I described. Okay, so ethanol has been the focus of DOE's biofuels program for the last 5 years. Another company is successfully taking municipal solid waste, which is shown as shredded MSW in the upper left picture. And that's anything reasonable that comes out of a landfill that can be shredded and fed to a reactor. They as well go through the syngas route to get to ethanol. Demolition wood is another type of material that they use at a very large pilot scale, 20 tons per day, to get to ethanol. But what their difference is they're getting to ethanol through methanol, which you can then use to couple to a variety of catalytic reactions to get to hydrocarbon fuels and chemicals. Point here is these types of feedstocks are dirty. Cleaning of the syngas before it goes on to catalytic reactions is critical, and it does take a lot of processes to do that. Another approach is aqueous sugar reforming. This is intermediate type temperatures, where we're taking the hydrolysates from the actual enzyme hydrolysis of biomass and taking it through aqueous phase reforming to get to a variety of fuels and chemicals. They as well can go to jet fuel and gasoline. If you look at the upper right trace, you can barely tell the difference between petroleum products and then the biofuels that are formed from the aqueous reforming process by Virent. This company as well has found a way to take this really mix of chemicals that are formed during aqueous phase reforming and get to plastics as well. And I do believe they're partnered with a variety of bottle companies to have these biodegradable plastics formed from biomass. As I mentioned, I talk just a bit about biochemical biomass conversion. Again, if you focus on the green boxes, you're taking a variety of biomass materials and enzymatically hydrolyzing them to get to the C5 and C6 sugars, which can then be fermented and then distilled to ethanol as a fuel. I also said I'd talk about hybrid approaches, and so one way to do this is to combine two of the technologies that I'm talking about. So if you look at taking syngas from a variety of streams, if you look on the left, this company is actually taking streams of CO-rich gas from actual steel-making practices, or from gasifier gas, which is syngas, finding microbes that they tailor to give them the actual fuel products that they want through fermentation, and they're getting to chemicals and fuels. Right now, LanzaTech is looking at ethanol production from syngas, biomass derived, and also from steel off-gases to get to ethanol. They also can form 2,3-butane-diol, which is a platform chemical to either fuels or chemicals, by tailoring the microbe's ability to produce these types of chemicals from the fermentation of the CO. Another company as well is doing the same type of processing, taking algae now and making green diesel. And that's utilizing carbon dioxide photosynthetically with the algae to get to triglycerides that you can then take through a refining process to get to jet fuel and green diesel. A little farther off, algae requires, the algae ponds can be capital cost intensive, as is the separations to actually get the lipids out of the algal growth media. But again, this is a nice picture of how you're taking two technologies, the best features of both, combining them to get the fuel precursors that you want. Another approach is the National Advanced Biofuels Consortium, where they're looking at the 6 processes on the left. I've touched on most of those, and looking at taking biomass through the pyrolysis route to get at oil-like materials that can go into various insertion points in petroleum refining. Key here is petroleum refiners want whatever we give them derived from biomass to look just like hydrocarbons. And so that is this particular approach is trying to down select the best processes that will do this to give us fuels that are refinery ready intermediates that then would go on to be processed into gasoline. So finally, as promised, I said one slide about what we're doing at NREL. We just completed a demonstration at half a ton per day of biomass fed thermochemically and biochemically in 2 different pilot scale systems to get to ethanol synthesis. Ethanol is the fuel of choice for DOE for the last 5 years. And so we do this through indirect biomass gasification, clean up the resultant syngas before it goes into a second catalytic reactor that forms primarily ethanol. Looking at data that we've just gathered over the summer, we had about 200 hours in 2 different demonstrations of continuous operations of biomass syngas at half a ton per day. Being fed into ethanol synthesis reactors. And what you're seeing on the right, rather than just show you ethanol production, is what happens when we look at changing the pressure in the reactor using actual biomass-derived syngas. And what we can report is the biomass syngas, if cleaned properly, had no impact on that catalyst, and we were able to make ethanol as fuel product. And so what we're doing now, since these demonstrations were conducted successfully in the last months, is now turning our focus towards looking at pyrolysis, and again, how we can take pyrolysis liquids, make them look like hydrocarbon fuels, either standalone or as intermediates to be put into petroleum refining operations. So what I've told you in the last 15 minutes is that we do have varied routes to biofuels that include thermochemical, biochemical, hybrid approaches. Distinction between those is really the temperatures at which you're operating and the catalysts that are required to get to the fuels that we want, which in the next 5 years focuses switch from ethanol for DOE to jet, diesel, and gasoline in that order. I'd also point out that the critical economic components for any of these processes are really feedstock availability and type. There's a lot of information out on the web about assessing our feedstock resources, as well the number of conversion steps and process conditions, catalyst costs, yields and selectivity, the waste generated, carbon usage for each of these processes are assessed and need to be further developed as improvements are made, just to understand how all this fits into feed, fiber, food sustainability issues as well. I'd leave you with feedstocks are different, and contaminants that are inherent to feedstock types require processing before they go on into any of these fuel scenarios. And what we're finding, in addition to fuels, is there is a lot of promise for taking biomass and deriving chemicals from them as well. That's an upcoming focus. I think that needs to have attention paid to it. So with that, I'll finish, and I thank you for your attention.